The pounding on the door came a little after midnight, and Nell Sutton knew before she was fully awake that it was the kind of knock that changes things. People do not beat on a widow's door in the black middle of a January night unless the world has come apart somewhere. She lit the lamp with hands that remembered how to be calm even when her heart was not, and she pulled her shawl around her. And she opened the door of her small rented room on the edge of Bell's Crossing to a wall of cold and snow, and standing in it was a man she had never seen before, a big rough mountain of a man crusted white with the storm, and in his arms, wrapped in what looked like every blanket he owned, was a baby so small and so still that for one terrible moment Nell thought he had carried a dead child. Down the mountain to her door, they said. The man got out, and his voice cracked to pieces on the first word. This huge, weathered man, cracked like river ice. Down at the Mercantile. The woman there. She said you knew babies. She said you'd birthed half the young ones in this valley before you. He stopped. He could not say it. Even a stranger, even half frozen and out of his mind with fear, could not say the thing to her face. Before you lost your own. My girl won't eat, he said instead. My baby. Her mama passed 3 months back bringing her, and she was little, but she was all right. She was taking the bottle all right. And then a week ago, she stopped. She won't take the bottle. She won't take the goat's milk. Doc Pruitt came up twice, and the second time he looked at me and he said, to make her comfortable. He said sometimes they don't. They're not meant to. The man's whole body shook, and it was not the cold. I can't watch her die. I buried her mother in the fall, and I cannot put that baby in the ground too. I cannot. I won't. And everybody in this whole valley has given up on her, and somebody told me that you might. Please, missus, I've got no right to ask it. I don't even know your name. But you're the last door there is. Nell Sutton looked at the tiny still face in the nest of blankets, and something in her that had been dead for 2 years. Something she had buried in the fall alongside a husband and a daughter of her own, and had not felt so much as stir since. Something in her woke up and stood up and reached out its arms. If you have ever had the very thing that broke you handed back to you as a chance to save someone else, if you have ever been so hollowed out by your own loss that you were sure you had nothing left to give anyone, and then found out you were wrong, that the very depth of what you'd suffered had made you the one person on earth who could help, then you will understand what happened next. And you will want to stay for it. This is the story of a mountain cowboy's dying baby, and a widow who had lost everything, and one long, cold night that saved them all. Stay with Nell to the end of it, and when you get there, do me the kindness of telling me in the comments what town you're watching from tonight, because these stories travel far, and I like to know how far. Now come inside out of the cold with me, into a small lamplit room in Bell's Crossing, Colorado, in the deep winter of 1887, where a grieving woman is about to take a dying child into her arms. Give her to me, Nell said, and come in before you freeze to death on my step. Come in, sit by the stove. Give her here. And the big man crossed her threshold and put the featherweight bundle into her arms with the desperate care of someone handing over the last precious thing he owns, and Nell Sutton drew back the blankets from the baby's face and felt her own breath stop. The child was failing. Nell had seen enough of both ends of life to know it on sight. The baby's skin had the waxy translucence of a candle burned near down to nothing. Her little cheeks, that should have been round, had gone hollow, and her eyes, when they fluttered open at the change of air, were dull and enormous in her shrunken face, and she did not cry. That was the worst of it, the thing that told Nell how far gone she was. A hungry baby cries. This baby had stopped crying. She had given up asking, the way the dying give up asking, and she lay in Nell's arms spending the last of herself on the simple work of breathing, in and out, each breath a little shallower than the last. How long since she took anything at all? Nell asked, already moving, already unwrapping the too many blankets that were smothering more than warming, already taking the measure of the child with her hands, the way she had once taken the measure of a dozen other babies in this valley, back when she had been the woman they sent for. Back before the fever took her own family and taught her that knowing how to save a life was no guarantee at all of getting to keep the ones you loved. Yesterday morning. A few swallows, not since. The man had lowered himself onto the stool by her stove, and he sat with his big, raw hands hanging empty between his knees, watching the baby with a terrible, fixed hope. As though he could hold her in this world by the force of his looking. I've tried everything. I warmed the milk, I cooled it, I tried a spoon, I tried a rag soaked in it. She just turns away. She hasn't the strength to fight it anymore. She just turns her little head away, and he scrubbed his face with his hands. Ellen would have known what to do. My wife. Ellen would have known. But Ellen's gone, and I'm just a fool of a man alone on a mountain who can rope a steer and can't keep his own child alive. Nell heard the man, but only distantly, because most of her attention had gone down into the baby, into the small, failing rhythm of her, and Nell was remembering something. She was remembering her own daughter, her Anna, in the last days, and how, at the very end, when the fever had wrung the little body dry, and there was nothing more the doctor or anyone could do, Nell had stopped trying to make Anna do anything at all. She had simply taken the baby out of the cradle and unbuttoned her own dress and laid that small, hot body against her own bare skin, against her heart, and wrapped them both in a shawl, and held her, just held her, skin to skin and heartbeat to heartbeat for the last long hours, so that whatever else was true, her baby would not be alone in the cold when she went. Anna had died that way, held. It had not saved her. Nothing could have saved her. But Nell had learned in those last hours a thing about babies that she had half known as a midwife and only understood completely as a mother, which was that a baby is not only a stomach to be filled. A baby is a small animal that has just been torn out of the only warm, dark, safe place it has ever known, and thrown into a world of cold and light and hunger and grief. And sometimes, Nell had come to believe, sometimes a baby stops eating not because its body has failed, but because its heart has. Because it has lost the one warm heartbeat it knew, and no one has given it another to hold on to, and it has simply decided, in whatever wordless way a baby decides things, that this cold new world is not worth the fighting. This baby had lost her mother. And then she had been passed from a grieving father's clumsy arms to a doctor's cold examination to a goat's teat to a tin spoon, warmed and cooled and coaxed and forced, and not once, Nell would have wagered her life on it, not once in 3 months had anyone simply held her slow, held her like she was safe, held her like there was all the time in the world and nowhere either of them needed to be. "Bring me that rocking chair from the corner," Nell said quietly, "and then I want you to stop talking, and I want you to bank that stove up as high as it'll go, and then I want you to sit down and be still, because what this baby needs right now is the one thing nobody's thought to give her, and it can't be hurried, and it can't be forced, and it's going to take the rest of this night, and maybe it won't work at all. But I'm going to try, because I know something about babies who've lost their mothers. I know it the hard way. Now hush, and bank that fire. And so Nell Sutton did the thing that no one else had thought to do. She sat down in the rocking chair by the roaring stove, and she loosened the neck of her own warm flannel nightdress, and she took that tiny dying baby out of her too many blankets and laid her against the bare warm skin of her chest, right over her heart, skin to skin, the way she had held her own Anna at the end. And she drew her big soft shawl around the both of them, so that only the baby's small face showed, cradled in the warm dark, pressed to the steady living drum of a human heart. And then she began, very slowly, to rock. The baby stirred. The change was so small that Ezra Wilder, watching from his stool with his fists pressed to his mouth, nearly missed it. But Nell felt it, felt the small body register the warmth, the softness, the heartbeat, felt some deep animal part of the baby that was older than thought take note that she was, for the first time in 3 months, being held against a living heart by someone who was not in a hurry. Nell did not offer her the bottle. That was the thing the others had gotten wrong, pushing the milk at a baby who had lost all reason to want it. Nell offered her nothing at all but warmth and time, and the sound of a heartbeat, and, after a while, low and soft, barely above the crackle of the stove, a song. It was an old song, a nothing song, the song Nell's own mother had sung to her, and that Nell had sung to Anna, a wandering, wordless tune that asked nothing and promised nothing, except that the singer was there, and would go on being there, in the dark, for as long as it took. An hour passed. The storm threw itself against the little window. Ezra Wilder sat frozen on his stool, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, watching this stranger hold his dying daughter against her heart and sing to her, and Nell rocked and did not stop and did not hurry, and after a while the baby's dull, enormous eyes drifted closed. But it was not the closing that Ezra feared. It was different. It was softer. It was the first true sleep the child had known in days, a sleep with warmth in it and a heartbeat under it, and the small hollow chest rose and fell, a little deeper now, a little easier. And still Nell did not reach for the bottle. She waited. She had all night. She had, if she was honest, nothing and no one else in the whole wide world to hurry home to. And so she could give this baby the one thing the baby needed most, which was a person with nowhere else to be. It was near 2 hours in, when the fire had burned down to a deep orange glow, and Ezra had finally, against his own will, begun to nod on his stool, that the baby woke. She woke slow, the way a warm and safe baby wakes. Not the sharp cry of distress, but a small, snuffling, rooting movement, her little head turning against Nell's warm skin, her tiny mouth working, and Nell felt her own heart leap so hard it hurt. Because she knew that movement. She knew it in her bones. It was the movement of a baby who has remembered, down in the wordless deep of herself, that she is hungry, that hunger is a thing worth answering, that the world, after all, might be worth staying in. Nell did not startle her. Slowly, keeping the baby warm against her the whole time, she reached for the bottle of goat's milk she'd set to warm in a pan of water at the edge of the stove, and she tested it against her wrist, and she brushed the rubber nipple against the baby's rooting lips, once softly, an offer and not a demand. and the baby took it. She took it slowly at first, a swallow, a pause, as though she had half forgotten how, and then something caught. Some old instinct woke all the way up, and she began to nurse at the bottle in earnest, her tiny hands coming up to press against the warm skin and soft shawl, her throat working swallow after swallow. And Nell Sutton sat in the rocking chair in the orange firelight with tears running silently down her face and dropping onto the shawl, and she rocked, and she sang under her breath, and she let that baby drink her fill for the first time in a week. Ezra Wilder had come off his stool. He was on his knees on the floor beside the rocking chair, this enormous man down on his knees. And he was watching his daughter eat with an expression that Nell would remember for the rest of her life, an expression of such raw and total disbelief, such shattered gratitude that she had to look away from it, because it was too naked a thing to witness. "She's eating," he whispered. "She's eating. Oh, God, she's eating." And he put his face down into his own hands, and he wept silently, his big shoulders shaking. The weeping of a man who has been holding back an ocean for months and has finally been given permission to let it go. "How?" he got out. "How did you?" Everyone said. The doctor said, "How did you do it?" "I held her," Nell said softly, so as not to disturb the baby who was nursing steadily now, her color already coming back, a faint flush of pink creeping into the waxy little cheeks. That's all. That's the whole of it. I didn't do anything clever. Mister, I'm sorry, I don't even know your name. I just held her. This baby wasn't only hungry in her stomach. She was hungry in her heart. She lost her mama, and nobody could give her another warm place to be. And a baby can't live on milk alone any more than the rest of us can. She needed to be held by somebody who wasn't afraid of losing her. Somebody with nothing left to lose. Nell looked down at the small drinking face, and something old and broken in her shifted and eased to smallest fraction. I had nothing left to lose. So I could hold her slow. That's the whole secret. There's no magic in it. There's just a warm chest and a heartbeat and a person who isn't in a hurry, and God help us, that's the one thing hardest to come by in this world. "Wilder," the man said. "Ezra Wilder. And I'll be in your debt till the day I die, Mrs. whatever your name is." He wiped his face, unashamed now, past shame. "You saved her. When every soul in that valley had given her up, you saved her with your own 2 arms. I don't have words for what that." "There aren't words." "Nell," she said. "Nell Sutton." And she looked at this rough, grieving mountain of a man kneeling on her floor, and at the tiny life reviving against her heart, and she felt, for the first time since she had lowered 2 coffins into the frozen ground 2 years gone, something that she had thought was dead in her forever. She felt useful. She felt, God help her, she felt like herself again. The self she had been before grief hollowed her out. The self who was good for something, who had a gift and a purpose and a place in the turning of the world. "And you don't owe me anything, Mistress Wilder," she said. "You've got it backwards. You knocked on my door in the middle of the night, and you handed me the one thing that could bring me back from where I've been these 2 years. I've been a ghost, Mistress Wilder. I've been dead and walking since the fever took my Daniel and my Anna. And you just handed me a reason to be alive again, wrapped in 6 blankets on my own doorstep. So let's not talk about debts. Let's just get this baby fed and warm and sleeping, and then in the morning we'll figure out what comes next. Because I'll tell you this much for free. I am not letting this child out of my sight until I'm sure she's going to stay in this world. I've lost one baby. I haven't got another one in me to lose. It was decided in the practical way that hard country decides things that Nell would come up the mountain. There was no other sense to be made of it. The baby needed round the clock holding and feeding by someone who knew how. And Ezra Wilder's homestead was a full day's hard ride up into the high country. Too far to carry a fragile infant back and forth, and Nell had nothing in Bell's Crossing to hold her. No family, no work that couldn't be let go, nothing but a rented room and a grief she was glad to leave behind for a while. So when the storm broke, 2 days later, and the baby was strong enough to travel, wrapped warm against Nell's body inside her coat, they went up, Ezra breaking trail on his big mountain horse, and Nell riding behind on a borrowed mare with the baby held to her heart. Up through the snow-heavy pines and along the icy switchbacks, and into a country so high and so white and so silent that it seemed to Nell they had ridden clean out of the world she knew and into some older, purer one. The Wilder homestead sat in a high mountain park, a wide white meadow ringed by black timber, and, above the timber, the raw stone peaks catching the last of the light. It was a good, strong, lonely place. Ezra had built the cabin himself, big-shouldered and tight against the weather, and there was a barn and a horse corral, and running through it all, the sound of a creek that never quite froze. And above and around and over everything, the enormous mountain silence. A silence so deep and so old that Nell felt it settle into her bones the moment she rode into it, and understood, in a way she could not have put words to, why a man who had lost his wife might come up here to hide from the world, and why a child raised in this silence, with no mother and a grief-locked father, might have simply stopped trying to live. It was beautiful. It was also terribly, dangerously alone. A woman could love a place like this, Nell thought. A woman could also die of the loneliness of it, and so, she thought, looking at Ezra Wilder's shuttered face, could a man. The cabin, when she stepped into it, told her the whole of Ezra's grief without his saying a word. The same way the mountain had. It was clean, in the rough way of a man who cleans by main force, but it was a tomb. There was no softness in it anywhere, no small comforts, no evidence that anyone had done anything in that house but grimly survive since the woman of it had died. And in the corner, near the big bed, there stood a cradle, a beautiful cradle, hand-carved, clearly made by Ezra himself in the good hopeful months before everything went wrong, made with love by a man's rough hands for a child he had been waiting for, and the baby had not been sleeping in it. Nell could see that at a glance. The cradle stood pushed into the corner, half turned to the wall, with a folded quilt laid over the top of it as though to hide it, and the baby's things. The few pitiful things were scattered on the far side of the room by the stove, as far from that cradle as the small cabin allowed. Nell looked at that turned-away cradle with the quilt thrown over it, and she understood, and her heart broke for the second time in 3 days. "You don't put her in the cradle," Nell said. It was not a question. Ezra Wilder stood in the doorway of his own home with snow melting off his shoulders, and he looked at the cradle he had made, and his jaw worked, and for a long moment she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "Lo, I made that cradle for Ellen's baby, for the child Ellen was going to raise." He took a breath that shook. Ellen didn't. Ellen died. And I know it makes no sense. I know it's a madness, but I can't. I can't put that baby in that cradle. It was supposed to be, it was for a different, it was for the family we were going to. And that's gone. So she sleeps in a box by the stove, and I know that's wrong. I know it. You don't have to look at me like that. But I can't put her in the cradle I built when I still thought I got to keep my wife. He turned away to the fire to hide his face. There's a lot of things about that baby I can't do, he said, so quietly Nell almost missed it. You'll find that out soon enough. You'll think I'm a monster. Maybe I am. I don't think you're a monster, Nell said. I think you're a man who's so afraid of losing that baby that you won't let yourself love her. And I know exactly how that feels, because I did the same thing backwards. When my Anna was dying, I loved her so hard and so desperate it near killed me, and when she went, I swore I'd never love anything that much again, because I couldn't survive it twice. You and I are the same, Mr. Wilder. We're just standing on opposite sides of the same locked door. You won't love her because you're scared she'll die. I won't love anything because mine already did. And that baby there is going to teach us both how wrong we are, if we let her. Because a baby doesn't care about our grief. A baby only knows she's here, and she's hungry, and she wants to be held, and she's got no patience at all for two grown fools too frightened of the dark to turn on the light. She crossed the cabin, the baby warm and sleeping against her, and she stood in front of that turned-away cradle, and she looked at Ezra. May I? He didn't answer, but he didn't stop her. And Nell Sutton set the baby down for a moment in her box by the stove, and then she took hold of that beautiful hand-carved cradle, and she turned it back around to face the room, and she lifted off the hiding quilt and shook it out and laid it soft inside the cradle as a blanket, and she pushed the cradle over close to the stove where it was warm, and where, she noted, it could be seen from the big bed. And then she lifted the sleeping baby and laid her down in the cradle her father had made for her, in the place she was always meant to sleep, and the baby sighed and settled into it as though she had come home. Ezra Wilder watched all of this without a word, standing rigid by the fire, and when it was done, when his daughter lay sleeping in the cradle he had carved for her, he made a sound, a single broken sound, and he went out of the cabin into the snow, and Nell let him go, because some griefs a person has to walk out into the cold alone, and she had learned not to chase them. The days that followed on the mountain were the strangest, and Nell would come to understand. The most healing of her life. She fell into the round-the-clock work of a newborn, the feeding and the changing and the endless holding, and she was good at it, she was better than good, and under her care the baby bloomed like a flower brought in from the cold. The hollow cheeks filled out and went round and pink. The dull, enormous eyes brightened and began to track, and, within 2 weeks, to find Nell's face and hold on it. The baby began to gain weight, real weight, the sturdy heft of a healthy infant, and she began to make the small, cooing sounds that healthy babies make, and one gray afternoon, for the first time, she smiled, a real smile, gummy and sudden and delighted, up into Nell's face, and Nell laughed out loud in the silent cabin, a sound she had not heard from her own throat in 2 years, and then sat down and cried, because the smile was so like Anna's, and because it was not Anna's, because it belonged to a living child who was going to stay, and both of those things at once were almost more than a heart could hold. She made that grim cabin into a home in those weeks, the same way she made everything. Without any fuss or announcement, simply by doing the small warm things, one after another, until the place was transformed. She scrubbed the winter grime from the one window so the hard, bright mountain light came through clean. She found Ellen's things, the first Ellen's, the dead wife's, small treasures packed away in a trunk where Ezra could neither look at them nor throw them out. And she did not disturb the ones that were his to grieve, but she took out the woman's good cooking pot and her rolling pin and put them to use. Because a house should be lived in, and a dead woman's tools are honored more by use than by burial. And Ezra watched her cook with his first wife's rolling pin and said nothing, but Nell saw that it eased something in him rather than hurt him. To see the woman's things in a woman's hands again, to see her kitchen become a kitchen once more instead of a shrine. She baked bread, and the smell of it filled the cabin and drifted out across the snow, and Ezra came in from the barn that first baking day and stopped in the door and breathed it in with his eyes closed and said, "Rough, Ellen used to bake of a Saturday. Whole cabin smell like this. I'd forgot. I'd made myself forget." And Nell said gently, "You don't have to forget the good things to make room for new ones. That's the mistake we both made, you and I. We thought we had to bury the whole of it. But you can keep the good smell of a Saturday and still have room for a Tuesday's loaf. There's no shortage of room in a heart. That's the secret nobody tells you. It only ever gets bigger." And that evening they ate together, the two of them, at the table with the baby's cradle rocking gently beside them, and it was the first meal in that cabin in a long time that was a meal and not merely a feeding. And Ezra ate 3 helpings and then sat back and looked at the woman across his table with the firelight on her face and a sleeping baby beside her. And something moved across his hard features that he did not have the words for and did not try to say, and Nell, catching it, felt her own weathered heart give a small, unruly leap that she scolded herself for and could not entirely put down. Neither of them spoke of it. It was too soon, and they were both too scarred, and there was too much grief still fresh in that house to make room yet for anything so presumptuous as hope. But it had been there, in the warm lamplit quiet, plain as the bread on the table, and they had both felt it, and neither of them, that night, was quite as alone in the world as they had been the night before. But it was Ezra who was the harder patient. The baby's body had only needed warmth and milk and holding, and those Nell could give. Ezra's wound was deeper and more tangled, and Nell could not hold him the way she held the baby, could only work at the edges of him, patient, the way you work at a knot too tight to force. He would not touch the baby. That was the thing. He provided for her. He chopped the wood and hauled the water and rode down the mountain through the snow to fetch more goat's milk when it ran low. He did every hard thing a father could do at arm's length. But he would not hold her. Nell would say, "Here, sit down, hold your daughter a while. My arms are tired." And Ezra would go gray and still and find some urgent reason to be out at the barn, and Nell understood that he was terrified. That to hold that baby, to feel her warm and alive and his, would be to love her. And to love her would be to hand fate one more hostage, one more thing that could be taken, and Ezra Wilder had decided somewhere in his grief that he would rather feel nothing at all than risk feeling that again. He had not even named her, 3 months old, and the child had no name. He called her the baby, or the little one, or nothing at all, and Nell had taken to calling her Lamb for want of anything better, and every time she did, she saw it cut Ezra like a knife, the namelessness of his own child, and still he could not do it, could not speak a name over her. because a name was a claim, and a claim was a hope, and hope was the one thing that grief had taught Ezra Wilder to be most afraid of. The thing that finally cracked Ezra Wilder open came on a night near the end of Nell's third week on the mountain, and it came, as these things do, through no cleverness of Nell's, but through the baby herself. It was the deep middle of the night, and the baby woke hungry, and Nell, who had been up with her twice already and was bone-weary in a way that 3 weeks of broken sleep will make a person, was slow to wake, slower than usual, sunk deep in exhaustion. And by the time she swam up out of sleep, the baby was crying in earnest, a good, strong, healthy, outraged cry. The cry of a baby who knows now that she is worth feeding and intends to be fed. And in the dark across the cabin, Nell heard the ropes of the big bed creak, and heard Ezra's bare feet hit the floor, and heard him cross to the cradle, half asleep, moving before his fear could wake up and stop him. And she heard him lift his crying daughter out of the cradle and gather her up against his bare chest, and murmur to her, rough and low and thick with sleep, "Hush now. Hush now. I've got you. Papa's got you." Nell lay very still in the dark and did not breathe. She understood that a miracle was happening, and that miracles are shy, and that if she moved or spoke or lit the lamp, she would break it. In the dark, Ezra Wilder walked his crying daughter up and down the cabin, patting her small back, and slowly the crying wound down, gentled by the warmth of him, by the deep rumble of his voice. And Nell heard him settle into the rocking chair with the baby against his chest, and she heard him go still, and she heard after a while a sound she had not heard from him before, which was the sound of a man talking to his child. "You gave us a scare," he was saying, low, almost too low to hear. "You gave your papa an awful scare, little one. I thought I was going to lose you too. I thought." His voice caught. "I made up my mind not to love you. Did you know that? What kind of a man makes up his mind not to love his own baby? But I was so scared. I was so scared you'd go the way your mama went, and I didn't think I could stand it, so I thought if I just didn't let myself, if I just kept you at arm's length." He was quiet a moment. The fire popped. "But you don't care about any of that, do you? You just want your papa to hold you. That's all you ever wanted. And I was too busy being afraid to give you the one thing you were asking for." And Ezra Wilder, alone in the dark, or believing himself alone, bent his rough head over his daughter and began, at last, to love her out loud. And Nell Sutton lay in her bed across the cabin with tears sliding into her hair, and thanked God, whom she had not been on speaking terms with in 2 years, for the mercy of it. In the morning, neither of them spoke of it directly, because they were both private people wrung out by grief and unused to the language of the heart, but everything had changed, and they both knew it. Ezra held the baby now, awkwardly at first, and then less so, and by the week's end he had taken to holding her of an evening by the fire while Nell cooked, the huge man and the tiny child, and he had begun, haltingly, to talk to her in front of Nell, no longer needing the cover of dark. And one evening, watching him, Nell said gently, "She ought to have a name, Ezra. She's earned one. She fought her way back into this world, and she's going to stay in it, and a girl who's done all that deserves a name to be called by." And Ezra looked down at his daughter for a long time, and Nell watched him wrestle with it, watched the old fear rise up, the fear that to name her was to claim, her was to risk her, and watched him, this time, master it. "Ellen," he said at last, roughly for her mother. Ellen, and then, looking up at Nell with something in his face that had not been there before, something warmer and more frightening than gratitude, Ellen, Grace. The grace part's for you. For the grace you brought up this mountain with you. If that's all right. If you don't mind sharing your goodness with my girl's name. And Nell Sutton, who had come up a mountain a hollowed-out ghost 3 weeks before, stood in a warm cabin holding a wooden spoon and looked at a rough, grieving cowboy naming his rescued daughter partly after her, and felt the last frozen corner of her own heart give way and begin, painfully, wonderfully, to thaw. Ezra began, in his rough, wordless way, to court her after that. Though it would have taken a sharp eye to name it courting, and Nell herself did not let herself name it for a long time, because to name it would be to hope for it. But it was there in 100 small mountain kindnesses. It was there in the way he began to bring things in from his rides down the valley, small, unnecessary things, a twist of paper with hard candy in it, a length of blue ribbon he'd seen and thought of her, a bag of the good coffee instead of the cheap, laying them on the table without a word and going red about the ears when she thanked him. It was there in the way he took to warming her side of the cabin first of a cold morning, banking the stove and setting the coffee before he woke her, so that she came out of sleep to warmth and the smell of it, small comforts she had not been shown by anyone since Daniel died. It was there in the way he watched her, when he thought she wasn't looking, with an expression on his hard face that she could not let herself examine too closely for fear of what she'd find in it and want. And it was there, most of all, in the work they learned to do together, the deep, unglamorous partnership of two people keeping a hard place alive through a hard season. Ezra taught her the mountain, taught her to read the weather off the peaks and to know which clouds meant a storm worth fearing, taught her to snowshoe out to the barn when the drifts came up past the windows, taught her the names of the great silent mountains that ring their home. And Nell taught him things in turn, taught him that a house could be more than a shelter, taught him small graces he'd forgotten or never known, a cloth on the table, a song in the evening, bread instead of hardtack, and watched him relearn, week by week, that a life could be more than mere survival, that a man was allowed, even out here, even after everything, to be not just alive, but warm. They fell into a rhythm together, an easy, sure rhythm, the rhythm of two people whose separate hard competencies fit together into something stronger than either alone. And though neither of them said a word about love all through those deep snowbound weeks, the love was building itself anyway. In the 1,000 small motions of a shared life, laying itself down course by course like a stone wall built to stand 100 years. One evening she caught him whittling by the fire and asked what he was making, and he showed her, gruff and shy, a small wooden horse for the baby, for when she was older, the first toy he had let himself make since the cradle. And Nell understood the whole enormous meaning of it, that Ezra Wilder had begun to believe in the future again, had begun to make things for a child he now trusted would live to play with them, and she had to turn back to her cooking quickly so he would not see her face. Winter deepened around them and locked them in, and Nell would look back on those snowbound weeks as a kind of enchantment. A time out of time, the three of them sealed together in the warm cabin while the great storms roared over the high peaks and buried the world in white. She had never meant to stay so long. She had come up for a few days, a week, to see the baby through the worst of it. But the worst of it had passed, and she had not gone, and Ezra had not asked her to go. and the snow had piled up in the passes until going anywhere became impossible, and none of them, if they were honest, minded that at all. They had become, without any of them deciding it or daring to name it, a family. Nell cooked and kept the house and mothered little Ellen Grace, and Ezra did the hard mountain work of keeping them all alive through a high country winter. And in the evenings they sat together by the fire, the three of them, and something grew between the two grieving adults, slow and quiet and deep, something neither of them spoke of because both of them were afraid, in the particular way of people who have loved and lost and know exactly what there is to be afraid of. But it was there. It was in the way Ezra saved the sweetest parts of his day to tell her at supper. It was in the way Nell found herself humming while she worked, and dressing with a little more care, and looking up whenever his step sounded on the porch. It was in the long, comfortable silences that were not empty, but full. The silences of two people who no longer needed to feel the quiet because the quiet itself had become a kind of company. It was in the night Ellen Grace ran a small fever, nothing serious, a tooth coming, but it frightened them both back to their deepest terror. And they sat up together the whole night on either side of the cradle, and toward dawn, when the fever broke and the baby slept easy, Nell had wept with relief, and Ezra had crossed the cabin and, for the first time, put his arms around her and held her while she cried, and neither of them had said a word, and it had been the most natural thing in the world, and also the most terrifying. And in the morning they had both retreated from it, shy as deer, because to speak of it would be to admit it, and to admit it would be to want it, and to want it would be to risk it, and they were not, either of them, ready yet to risk anything so precious again. There came a night, deep in that snowbound time, when the two of them talked at last about their dead, and it was the closest thing to a courtship either of them would have that winter, though neither called it that. It was late, and the baby was down, and a blizzard had shut the world away outside so completely that the cabin felt like the last warm room in all creation. And they had lingered by the fire past the hour they usually parted for their separate beds. Nell was mending by the light of the lamp, and Ezra was oiling a bridle he did not need to oil, and it was Ezra, surprising them both, who broke the thing open. "Tell me about them," he said. "Your husband, your little girl. You've been in this house near a month, and you've never once said their names. And I've a notion you've been carrying them so long alone that they've gotten heavy. I know how heavy. So tell me. I'd like to know who it is you've been grieving. I'd like to know their names." And so Nell told him. She told him about Daniel, her first husband, a quiet, steady farmer who had never once made her feel too big or too plain, who had courted her with wildflowers and married her in a borrowed suit, and worked himself half to death to keep their little farm afloat. She told him about the farm, the good years of it, the way she had thought her life was settled and small and happy. And she told him about Anna, her daughter, born after 4 hard years of hoping, the most wanted baby that was ever born. And about the 2 short years she'd had her, the fat, wondering baby growing into a laughing, dark-eyed girl. And then she told him about the fever, the terrible autumn the fever came through the valley and took 1/3 of the children in it and her husband besides, how she had nursed them both and could save neither, how Daniel had gone first, and then, a week later, Anna. And how Nell had held her baby against her heart through the last long night, the way she'd held Ezra's baby the night he came to her door, and how Anna had died anyway, held and loved and warm, and how Nell had wanted to die too, had prayed to die, had been almost angry to find herself still alive and breathing in a world that had taken everything from her. She told him all of it, in the firelight, in a low, steady voice, and Ezra Wilder set down his bridle and listened to every word without once looking away. And when she was done, he did not say any of the useless things people say. The God has a plan, and they're there in a better place that had made Nell want to scream at every funeral she'd ever stood through. He said only, Anna and Daniel. I'll remember them. As long as I live, there'll be two people in the world besides you who know their names and honor them. You're not carrying them alone anymore, Nell. Set that weight down a while. I'll help you hold it. And then, because she had given him hers, Ezra gave her his in return, and told her about Ellen, the real Ellen, the first Ellen, told her things Nell suspected he had never told a soul. How he'd met her back east, and how she'd been too fine and too gentle for the hard country he'd dragged her out to, and how he'd known it and married her anyway because he could not bear to live without her, and how he had never quite forgiven himself for it, for wanting the mountain more than he'd wanted her comfort, for the baby that came and took her from him as if in payment for his selfishness. He told her about the night Ellen died, the storm and the blood and the doctor who could not get through, the same helplessness that Nell knew from the other side, and how he had sat with his dead wife and his living newborn daughter and felt nothing but a black roaring guilt, how he had looked at the baby and been unable to love her because she had cost him Ellen, and how the shame of that, the shame of a man who could not love his own motherless child, had been eating him alive all winter until Nell came and showed him it was only fear wearing the mask of. Not caring. I thought I was a monster, he said again as he had that first day. You keep telling me I'm not. I'm starting, God help me, I'm starting to believe you. And Nell reached across the small space between their chairs and laid her hand over his scarred one, and they sat like that a long while. Two people who had each been alone in their grief for so long, no longer alone in it. While the blizzard howled itself out over the peaks, and the fire burned down low, and the two babies of their two dead loves slept safe in the next room, one in the ground far away, and one in a cradle close by, both of them held now, both of them honored, both of them woven into whatever this new thing was that was slowly, warmly, terrifyingly growing up between the man and the woman by the fire. Nell knew she should go. That was the truth that sat at the bottom of all that mountain happiness like a stone at the bottom of a clear pool. The baby was well now, thriving, out of all danger. Ezra had learned to father her. There was no longer any real reason for Nell Sutton to be living in a widower's cabin high on a lonely mountain. No reason at all except the one reason neither of them would say. And a woman's reputation was a fragile thing, even a day's ride from the nearest gossip. And Nell knew, in the practical corner of her mind that grief had never quite been able to shut down, that this could not go on forever, that sooner or later the snow would melt and the world would come back and the world would have things too. Say about a widow and a widower snowbound together all winter with no wedding ring between them. She knew it. She just could not make herself do anything about it, because for the first time in 2 years she was happy, and she had forgotten in her long grief how hard it is to make yourself walk away from happiness, even when you know you should, even when you are half sure it cannot last. There was a thaw in February, a false spring of the kind the mountains sometimes grant in the middle of the hard months, and the passes opened for a week, and their supplies had run low enough that a trip to town could not be put off. Ezra would have gone himself and left Nell and the baby safe on the mountain, but Ellen Grace needed things only a woman could rightly choose. And the goat's milk had to be arranged for, and so they went down together, all three of them, Nell riding into Bell's Crossing for the first time since the night Ezra had carried his dying daughter up out of it. And Nell discovered, the moment they rode down the main street, that the valley had been busy about her in her absence. She felt it the way she'd felt such things her whole life. The turning of heads, the leaning together, the conversations that stopped as she passed and started up again, lower, behind her. She heard the word that got said about a woman who lived unwed in a man's cabin, heard it not quite said to her face, but said near enough that she was meant to hear it. And she saw the respectable women of Bell's Crossing draw their skirts and their daughters a little closer as the mountain man and the heavy widow and the baby went by. It was nothing she had not weathered before, in one form or another, her whole life. But it landed harder now, because now she had something to lose, and because she saw Ezra's jaw go tight and knew that he heard it too. And knew it shamed him, not of her, but for her, that his choosing her had painted a target on her broad back. But there was one door in Bell's Crossing that opened warm to her, and it mattered more than all the cold ones. It was the door of the mercantile, and behind the counter stood the woman who had sent Ezra to Nell in the first place, that desperate night. A stout no-nonsense storekeeper's widow named Bess Tandy. And when Nell came through the door, Bess Tandy came out from behind her counter and took both Nell's cold hands in her warm ones and said, loud, plenty loud enough for the two gossiping women fingering calico by the window to hear, well, if it isn't the woman who did what Doc Pruitt couldn't. I heard that baby lived. I heard she's fat and sassy now. I sent that poor man to your door on nothing but a prayer and a notion, and you went and worked a miracle with it, and I've told everyone in this valley who'd hold still to listen that Nell Sutton has got the surest hands and the biggest heart in this whole county, and I'll thank the rest of them. Here her voice rose pointedly. To remember that a woman who will ride out in a blizzard to save a dying baby is worth 10 of the fine ladies who sit warm in church judging her for it. And the two women by the calico found somewhere else to be, and Bess Tandy winked at Nell and began filling her order with an extra measure of everything. And Nell Sutton stood in that warm store and understood that even in a valley full of cold judgment there is nearly always one warm heart, if you can find it, and that one is enough to see you through. She never forgot it. In the years that followed, when Nell Wilder had become the most respected woman in that county, she made a point of being to every frightened judged newcomer what Bess Tandy had been to her that February morning, the one warm door, and she counted it among the most important work of her life. The world came back in the person of Harlan Wilder, Ezra's younger brother, who rode up the mountain on the first passable day of the thaw in the raw, muddy edge of spring, and brought the outside world's judgment with him like a cold draft through an open door. Harlan Wilder was a prosperous man. He had a freighting business down in the valley and a fine house in Bell's Crossing and a wife with social ambitions. And he had never understood his older brother's choice to bury himself on a mountain running cattle, and he had understood it even less since Ellen died. He came up ostensibly to see how Ezra had fared through the winter, and he was genuinely glad to find the baby alive, for he was not a cruel man, only a conventional one, which can do near as much damage in this world. But it took him about 1 hour in that cabin to size up the situation, and to decide, in the certain way of conventional men, that it would not do. He watched Nell move about the cabin, easy and at home, watched her lift the baby and quiet her, watched the way his hard, silent brother's eyes followed the woman around the room, and Harlan Wilder set down his coffee cup and asked Ezra to step outside. And out in the muddy yard, not quite far enough from the cabin, he said his piece. "You have to see how it looks, Ezra. A woman living up here with you all winter. No kin, no husband, a widow you took up off the street in the middle of the night. The whole valley's talking. Sue heard it in church. They're saying, well, you can imagine what they're saying. And the baby, Ezra, little Ellen. You want that child growing up with that hanging over her, raised by a, forgive me, but nobody even knows what this woman is to you. A hired nurse? A housekeeper? Something else? You can't keep her up here like this. It isn't decent, and it isn't fair to the child." Harlan spread his hands. "Reasonable, kindly, immovable, Sue and I have talked about it. We'll take the baby, raise her as our own, down in town, proper, with schooling and church and a respectable name. We can't have children of our own. You know that's been our sorrow, and we'd love that little girl like she was ours. It's the sensible thing. Let the woman go back to wherever she came from, and let Ellen grow up decent, and you can come down and see her whenever you like. It's the right thing, Ezra. I know it's hard. But it's the right thing, and you know it. And here was the terrible cunning of it, though Harlan meant no cunning by it, meant only kindness, as he understood kindness. He had found the exact shape of Ezra Wilder's oldest fear and pressed on it. For Ezra had spent his daughter's whole short life braced for the certainty that he would fail her, that a rough, motherless man alone on a mountain had no business raising a little girl, that he would ruin her or lose her the way he had lost her mother. And here was his own brother, prosperous and respectable, offering to take that whole crushing weight off him, offering to give little Ellen everything Ezra in his black moments was sure he could never give her himself. And worse, far worse, Harlan had named the thing that Ezra had refused to name all winter. The thing about Nell had held it up in the cold light of the valley's judgment and made it look shameful, made the best thing that had happened to Ezra in a year look like a scandal, a thing to be tidied away. Nell, listening at the cabin window with the baby in her arms and her heart turning to ice, heard Ezra say nothing, heard her whole winter's happiness meet the world's cold judgment, and heard the man she had come to love say nothing at all in its defense, and she understood, or thought she understood, that it was over, that the enchantment had ended the moment the world rode back up the mountain, and that she had been a fool, an old grieving fool, to let herself forget even for one winter that the world had no place in it for a woman like her. Harlan rode back down the mountain at dusk, saying he'd return in 3 days for Ezra's answer, and he plainly assumed for the baby. And that night the cabin that had been so warm all winter was cold, with everything unspoken. Ezra sat at the table and stared at his hands and said nothing. Nell fed the baby and put her down in the cradle and moved about the small space with her heart breaking quietly, and at last, because she could not bear the silence, she said the thing she had decided, out in the cold, clear misery of the afternoon, that she must say. "Your brother's right, Ezra, about how it looks. I should have gone weeks ago, and I let myself pretend. And that was wrong of me, and it's the baby who'll pay for it if I stay. So I'll go. When the trail's clear, I'll go back down to Bell's Crossing, and I'll go on somewhere else after that, somewhere nobody knows, and you won't have to. There won't be any more talk." Her voice was very steady. She had a great deal of practice at saying unbearable things steadily. And Ezra, about Ellen, about letting Harlan take her. She had to stop and start again. I think maybe you should let him." I never thought I'd say it. "But he can give her things you can't, and I can't, things a little girl needs, a settled home, and a mother who's her own and no shadow on her name, and if you love her, and I know you do now, then maybe loving her means letting her go somewhere she can have all that. I gave her back her life. I don't have any right to more than that. Neither of us does. We're just two broken people who found her, Ezra. We were never going to get to keep her. People like us don't get to keep the good things. I learned that a long time ago, and I forgot it this winter, and I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I let us both forget it." And she believed every word of it. That was the terrible thing. She had so thoroughly absorbed the lesson the world had beaten into her, the lesson that a woman like her, poor and plain and heavy and twice bereaved, was fit to serve the good things of life, but never to possess them. That she could stand in that cabin and hand away her own heart and call it love, call it the right thing. Call it what a good woman does. She was already reaching for her carpet-bag when Ezra Wilder finally spoke, and his voice, when it came, was not the flat, gray grief voice of the winter. It was shaking, but it was shaking with something else entirely. "Sit down," he said. "Nell, sit down and don't touch that bag." He stood up from the table, and he was a big man. And the cabin seemed to shrink around him, and there was a fire in his haunted eyes that she had never seen there before. "You want to know why I didn't say anything to Harlan? You've been standing there all evening thinking I agreed with him, thinking I'd let him take my daughter and let you walk down that mountain, and you've built your whole speech on it. I can see it on you. Well, you're wrong. I didn't say anything to Harlan because I was standing in that yard so full of things to say that I couldn't get a one of them out. Because if I'd opened my mouth, I think I'd have knocked my own brother down, and he came up here meaning well, and a man doesn't knock his brother down for meaning well." He came around the table. "You think I'd give Ellen to Harlan? You think I fought all winter? You think you held that baby back from the grave with your own two arms so I could hand her over to be raised proper by strangers in town? And you think I'd stand at that window? Yes, I saw you. I saw you listening, and let you tell yourself you're nothing. You're just a broken woman who doesn't get to keep good things? Nell, you are the best thing that ever came up this mountain. You saved my daughter's life, and then you saved mine. You dragged me back out of a grave I'd been digging myself into for a year, and I have been sitting at that table all night, not because I agree with my brother, but because I have been trying to find the courage to ask you the thing I've been wanting to ask you since about the second week, and being too much a coward to ask. And now you're standing there with your hand on a carpet-bag about to walk out of my life to save me from a scandal I don't give a damn about, and it's forced my hand, so here it is. God help me, here it is." And Ezra Wilder, mountain cowboy, who had not wept in front of another living soul until this woman came and cracked him open, got down on one knee on the rough plank floor of his cabin, in front of the stove, in front of the cradle where his daughter slept, and he took Nell Sutton's work-roughened hand in both of his big scarred ones, and he said, "Marry me." Not to stop the talk, though it stopped the talk. Not to give Ellen a mother, though God knows she's already got one and it's you. It's been you since that first night. She doesn't know any other. Marry me because I love you, Nell Sutton, because I didn't think I had any love left in me, and you proved me a liar. Because I want to come in from the cold every night of my life to your face and your voice and your suppers on the table. Because you and me are the same broken thing, and I've got a notion that two broken things, if you fit them together right, can make one whole one. I'm not much. I'm a rough man with a hard mountain and a sad past, and not two nickels to rub together most seasons. But I'm yours if you'll have me, every busted piece of me, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never again believe for 1 minute that you don't get to keep the good things. Because you're going to keep me. And you're going to keep that baby. And you're going to keep this whole mountain if I have any say in it. Marry me. Please, please don't walk down that trail. Stay and be my wife and Ellen's mama, and let's the three of us be a family out loud in front of the whole valley, and let them talk all they want. Nell Sutton stood in the firelit cabin with a rough man on his knee before her and the baby they had saved together sleeping warm in her cradle, and everything the world had ever taught her about her own worth stood up in her and told her to say no, told her this could not be for her, told her to take her carpet bag and go quietly the way she always went quietly. And for the first time in her whole grief-battered life, Nell Sutton told that voice to be silent. She got down on her own knees on the floor in front of Ezra, so that they were face to face, two grieving people kneeling together in the firelight, and she took his weathered face in her two soft hands, and she said, "Yes, God forgive me for near talking myself out of the only happiness I've been offered in 2 years. Yes, Ezra Wilder, I'll marry you. I'll be your wife, and I'll be that baby's mama, and I'll cook your suppers and warm your bed and grow old on this beautiful lonely mountain with you, and I'll fight your brother and the whole valley and anybody else who says a word about it. Because I am done. Do you hear me? I am finished believing that a woman like me doesn't get to be loved. You love me. I can see that you do. A person can't fake what's in your face right now. And I love you. I have loved you since I watched you learn to hold your own daughter in the dark, and I am going to keep you, Ezra. I am going to keep you and Ellen both. And no one, not your brother, not this valley, not grief itself, is ever going to take my family from me again. I lost one. I will not lose another. This one I keep." And Ezra Wilder gathered her up off that floor into his arms, this large, soft woman the world had thrown away, gathered her up like she was the most precious thing in the world, which to him she was, and he kissed her. And across the warm cabin, the baby they had saved slept on in the cradle her father had carved. And outside the great mountain held them all in its ancient silence. And for the first time in a long time, in that high, lonely place, there was nothing cold left anywhere in that house at all. Harlan came back up the mountain 3 days later, as he'd said he would, and he came expecting to carry a baby back down with him. And he found instead his brother and the widow standing together on the cabin porch in the thin spring sunshine, shoulder to shoulder, and the baby in the woman's arms, and he knew before a word was spoken that he had lost whatever contest he had imagined himself to be winning. Ezra stepped down off the porch to meet him, and he did not raise his voice. Ezra never raised his voice, but there was a bedrock underneath it now that had not been there before, the sound of a man who has remembered what he is willing to stand on. "I'm obliged to you for the offer, Harlan," Ezra said. "I know you meant it kind. You and Sue would have been good to her, and I know what it's cost the two of you not having little ones of your own, and I'm sorry for that grief. I truly am. I know now what that kind of grief tastes like." But you're not taking my daughter. Nell and I are to be married. Come the first Sunday, the preacher can ride up, or we can ride down. And Ellen's got her mother and father right here, and here is where she stays. And the talk in the valley can go hang. Any man wants to say a word against my wife, he can come up this mountain and say it to my face, and I don't expect I'll be troubled by many takers. He put out his hand to his brother. I'd rather we didn't quarrel over it. You're my brother, and I love you, and I want my girl to know her uncle. But if it comes to quarreling, Harlan, understand me, I will quarrel, and I won't lose. Because there is not one thing on this earth or over it that is going to part me from that woman and that child. Not any more. I've done my share of losing. I'm through. And Harlan Wilder looked at his brother, really looked at him, and saw a thing he had not seen in over a year, had feared he might never see again, which was Ezra alive, Ezra present, Ezra standing upright in his own life instead of moving through it like a ghost. And Harlan was a conventional man, but he was not a fool, and he was not, underneath the convention, an unloving one. He looked at the woman on the porch, at the way she held the baby, at the plain, unglamorous devotion in her face, and he looked at his brother restored to himself, and he did the sum, and he came up with the right answer, which was that whatever the valley said, whatever it looked like, this was a family, a true one, forged in a hard winter out of two broken people and a baby none of them should, by rights, have been able to save, and that a man would have to be a great fool indeed to take a hammer to a thing like that in the name of respectability. He took his brother's hand. And then, gruffly, because he was a Wilder and they did not do such things easily, he pulled Ezra into a rough embrace and held on a moment, and when he stepped back his eyes were wet. And he said, Sue's going to want to help with the wedding. You know how she is. She'll want to make the cake and sew the dress and run the whole show. You'd best let her. It'll mean something to her to be part of it. And that was Harlan Wilder's surrender and his blessing both, given the only way a proud man knows how to give such things, sideways and gruff and disguised as a favor to somebody else. Nell came down off the porch then with the baby, and she did the thing that made Harlan Wilder her friend for the rest of his life. She put little Ellen Grace into his arms, this baby he had come to take and been refused, and she said she should know her Uncle Harlan and her Aunt Sue. Ezra told me you've longed for a little one of your own, and I'm sorry the Lord hasn't seen fit. And I want you to know there's a place in this child's life for the both of you, a real place, aunt and uncle, godparents, if you'll stand up for her in the church. A child can't have too many people who love her. I ought to know. I'm trying to give this one everything I lost. So you come up this mountain any time you like, Harlan Wilder, and you bring Sue, and you love this girl all you want. Because there's no such thing in my house as too much love for a baby. There's only ever been too little. We're going to fix that, all of us together. And Harlan Wilder stood in the mountain sunshine holding the baby he had tried to take away, being offered instead a place in her life by the very woman he'd come to send packing. And he understood that he had come up this mountain thinking to rescue a child, and had found instead that the child had already been rescued, twice over, by a love bigger and stranger and stronger than anything the respectable valley had ever taught him to value, and he was humbled by it, and he was grateful, and he never again in his life said one word against Nell Sutton, but became instead her fiercest defender in every parlor in Bell's Crossing, which, given his standing, settled the valley's talk faster than any amount of Ezra's glaring ever could have. They were married in the little church in Bell's Crossing on a bright Sunday in late spring, when the mountain trails had opened and the whole valley could come. And the whole valley did come. Some of them to wish the couple well, and some of them, it must be said, to see for themselves the widow who had bewitched Ezra Wilder up on his mountain, for the talk had been considerable. But whatever they came for, they stayed for the wedding. And there is a particular silence that falls over even a gossiping crowd when it is shown a love that is plainly, undeniably real, and that silence fell over Bell's Crossing that Sunday. For Nell Sutton walked up the aisle in a dress that Sue Wilder had sewn with her own hands and her own glad tears, carrying not flowers, but the baby. Little Ellen Grace, fat and rosy and crowing now, 7 months old and the picture of health, the baby the whole valley had given up for dead in the winter, and who was living proof of what the woman at the altar could do with nothing but warm arms and a stubborn heart. And when the preacher asked who gave this woman to be married, it was Harlan Wilder who stood up. Harlan, who had come to take the baby and stayed to give away the bride, and his voice was thick when he said, "I do." Ezra Wilder waited at the front of that church in a suit that did not fit him, having been a rancher and not a suit-wearing man his whole life, and he watched his bride come up the aisle with his daughter in her arms. And the hard-weathered mountain of his face was working with emotion he'd long since given up trying to hide, and when Nell reached him, he took the baby in one arm and Nell's hand in the other, so that he stood at the altar holding both of them, his whole rescued family, and the preacher had to wait a moment for him to be able to speak his vows, and there was not a dry eye in that valley church. Not even among the ones who'd come to gawk. And when he was told he could kiss his bride, Ezra Wilder kissed Nell Sutton with the baby laughing between them, and the church erupted, and Sue Wilder cried into Harlan's shoulder, and outside the spring sun poured down on the muddy thawing valley, and the long winter was truly over at last, in every way there was. The years that followed were good years, hard the way all mountain years are hard, but good all the way down. Nell took to that high, lonely country the way she had taken to everything the good Lord set in front of her, with her sleeves rolled up and her heart wide open, and she made of Ezra's grim survivor's cabin a true home, warm and full and busy, the kind of home where people wanted to gather. She planted a garden in the short, fierce mountain summers and put up food against the long winters. She doctored the ranch hands and the neighbors from miles around, for word got out that Nell Wilder had a gift with the sick and the birthing, and she became again what she had been before her own grief unmade her, the woman they sent for, the safe pair of hands in the bad hours. And there was a deep healing in that for her, in being useful again, in turning the hard knowledge her losses had brought her into help for other people's crises. More than one failing mountain baby lived because Nell Wilder rode through the snow to sit up all night holding it against her heart, and taught its frightened mother to do the same. And every single time she did it, she thought of the night Ezra Wilder pounded on her door, and of her own Anna, and she understood that her Anna's short life and hard death had not, after all, been for nothing, because the love she had learned holding her dying daughter had gone on now to save a dozen other children, would go on saving them for as long as Nell had arms to hold them. And that was a kind of resurrection, the only kind this world reliably offers, the dead living on in the love they teach us before they go. There were more children in time. Nell had believed herself done with childbearing, had believed that particular door closed to her forever after the fever, but the mountain and the man and the great gladness of her new life seemed to work some quiet miracle in her, and when Ellen Grace was 2 there came a brother for her, a fat, squalling boy they named Daniel, for the husband Nell had buried. Ezra insisting on it, saying a man ought not to be jealous of the dead, that Nell's first husband had helped make her into the woman Ezra loved and deserved to have a Wilder carry his name. And 2 years after Daniel came a second girl, Anna, and Nell wept when Ezra suggested that name, wept and could not speak, because to give her lost daughter's name to a living child felt at first like it might be a betrayal or a wound, and it was Ezra, who had learned so much about grief from her, who now taught it back to her, saying gently, "She won't replace the one you lost. Nothing ever will. But there's no law says a name can only be used once, and I'd like our girl to carry a little of the one who taught you how to hold a dying baby. Seems to me that Anna ought to have a namesake in this world. Seems to me she earned it." And so there was an Anna in Nell's arms again, a different Anna, a living, laughing Anna, and it did not close the old wound. No living child could close that wound. But it laid a kind of grace over it, the way snow lays soft over the hard, scarred ground, and Nell healed a little more, the way she was always healing a little more, in that warm, full house on the high mountain. And through it, all there was Ellen Grace, the first one, the baby who had started everything, growing up tall and strong and merry in the mountain air, with no memory at all of the terrible winter she had been born into, no memory of the mother who had died bringing her, or the weeks she had spent fading toward the grave. To Ellen Grace there had only ever been Nell, only ever been Mama, warm and soft and always there, and only ever been Papa, who had been frightened once long before she could remember and was not frightened any more. She knew the story, of course. Nell made sure she knew it, made sure she knew about the brave, sad woman named Ellen who had given her life and whose picture hung now in an honored place on the cabin wall, and made sure she knew the whole tale of the midnight ride and the goat's milk and the long night by the fire. Nell never hid any of it, for she had learned that a family healed by grief must not pretend the grief away, must carry its dead along with it into the light, spoken of and honored and loved. But knowing the story did not make Ellen Grace's childhood a sad one. Quite the opposite. She grew up understanding, in the deep, wordless way of a well-loved child, that she was a person who had been fought for, that 2 broken, grieving grown-ups had wanted her so badly they had put themselves back together for her sake, and there is no more solid foundation to build a life upon than that, the sure knowledge that you were wanted, that you were fought for, that your very life was somebody's reason to go on living. Nell and Ezra grew old together on that mountain, and they grew old the way the lucky ones do, closer every year instead of further apart, 2 people who had each been so certain that love was a country closed to them forever, and had found their way into it together, late and grateful and astonished. Ezra never did become a talking man, but he learned over the years to say the things that mattered, learned it because he watched Nell nearly walk down that mountain once for want of hearing them, and he was not a man to make the same mistake twice. He told her she was beautiful, and meant it, on into the years when her dark hair went gray and her soft body went softer, because he had never loved her for being any particular shape, had loved her for the size of her heart and the warmth of her arms and the steel in her spine, and those only grew finer with age. And Nell, for her part, woke every single morning of her long marriage in a kind of quiet disbelief at her own good fortune, at the warm sleeping bulk of her husband beside her, and the sounds of her children in the loft, and a great mountain standing guard outside. And she never once took a day of it for granted, because she had lived the other life, the hollow one, the grieving one, and she knew exactly what a gift it was to have been given a second one. When she was an old woman, white-haired and stout and slow, Nell Wilder liked to sit of an evening in the same rocking chair where she had once held a dying baby back into the world. Out on the porch now in the warm months, looking out over the high mountain park that had been her whole world and her whole happiness for so many years. Her children were grown by then and had children of their own, and Ellen Grace, the first one, the miracle, had married a good man and settled on the next ridge over and had a passel of little ones who called Nell grandmother and climbed all over her the way her own had once done. And sometimes rocking in the mountain dusk with a grandchild drowsing in her lap. Nell would think back over the whole long, strange road of her life, and she would marvel at it, at how it had all turned. She would think of the young woman she had been, the midwife, the farmer's wife, so sure of her small, happy life. And she would think of the fever, and the 2 graves, and the hollow ghost she had become. The woman who walked through 2 years of her life already dead. Certain that the good things were behind her forever, and that a woman so battered and so plain and so heavy could hope for nothing more from this world than to be tolerated at its edges. And she would think of the pounding on her door at midnight, and the tiny dying face in the blankets, and the strange, terrible mercy of being handed, in the depth of her own ruin. The one thing that could bring her back to life. And she would want to reach back through all the years and take that hollow, grieving woman by the hand and tell her what was coming. She had wanted that before, about other women on other hard roads, and she had never been able to do it, but oh, how she wanted it now. Hold on, she would tell that grieving ghost of herself. I know you think it's over. I know you think you've had your portion of joy and buried it, and there's nothing left for a woman like you but to grow old alone and unwanted. But you're wrong. And you're wrong in the most wonderful way a person was ever wrong. There is a man up on a mountain you haven't met yet who is going to pound on your door in the dead of winter. And he is going to hand you a dying baby, and that baby is going to hand you back your whole life. You are going to be a wife again. You are going to be a mother again, more times than you dare dream. You are going to grow old on a mountain so beautiful it will make you weep, beside a man who thinks the sun rises and sets on your gray head, surrounded by children and grandchildren who will never once in their lives doubt that they were wanted, because you are going to make sure of it. Everything you think you lost forever is coming back to you up a snowy mountain trail. Just hold on. Just answer the door. For Nell Sutton, who had lost a husband and a baby and her own will to live, who had been so certain that the world had no place left in it for her, had answered a knock at midnight and taken a dying child into her arms, and in the saving of that child she had saved herself, and a grieving father, and had gathered up out of the wreckage of 3 broken lives one whole and shining family that should never, by any reasonable reckoning, have existed at all. She had lost everything, and then, on a mountain she had never meant to climb, in the arms of a man she had never meant to love, holding a baby who was never meant to live, she had found it all again, and more, pressed down and running over. She had found the place where a woman the world threw away turned out to be exactly, precisely, the one soul on earth who was needed. She had found the one place she was always meant to be. This was home, and she had stayed.